Welcome everyone to our CSP Improving CSP webinar series. Today we are starting off our second mini series with the topic of Zero Trust and Microsoft Cloud. Today we have Michael Batt and Rick Struckel as our presenters. Michael is one of our infrastructure security engineers, as well as Rick is on the cloud device management and security side. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Michael to go ahead and start the presentation on aligning Zero Trust with Microsoft Cloud. Michael, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. So we have a lot to cover, so I'll jump right into it. So first off, we're going to cover the base principles of Zero Trust, then talk a bit about why Zero Trust is important. So first off, Zero Trust, just realize it's a changing philosophy really from the traditional security principles. Zero Trust is going to always be about verifying access and connection points. There's not going to be any more of that implicit or assumed trust. So we need to verify explicitly. That old username password model that you may still be using or that you've been accustomed to for years, if you've been in the IT industry for a while, it simply does not provide the necessary protection to safeguard your environment. And that's especially true when it comes to the cloud. You really need additional measures to ensure that the user who's trying to sign in is who they claim to be, that the device that they're connecting from, that is not compromised and just generally in good shape, it's a healthy device, and that they're trying to access appropriate data points in your environment. Now, the second guiding principle of Zero Trust is to use least privileged access, only using the minimum required access rights, and then elevate on an as needed and really while it's needed basis. So the privilege elevation will reduce risk should an account become compromised, which unfortunately is a nice little segue into our final principle of assuming breach. This pillar assumes that access attempt is going to be a malicious. Every access attempt is really malicious in nature. Another way of think of this is just assume that your environment is about to become compromised. So how do you defend your environment when it is going to be compromised, not if, but when. So this area really focuses on minimizing that impact. So when that breach happens, how are we going to control that damage? We're going to do that by segmenting access, trying to encrypt all of your session data and data at rest, and also going to put a premium on monitoring and analyzing your environment to detect when risky sign-ins or just any unusual activity is occurring within your cloud infrastructure. So if you can go to the next slide, please. All right, so how do we apply these principles and take these guidelines and really put them into practice? The first step is to start with the concept on denying access to everything until that access is proven beyond just a username, which typically can be guessed, first initial, last name, first name dot last name, etc. I mean, what the typical ones are. So it can usually be fairly easy to guess what a user's name may be if you know what their name is. The second part of that is the password itself, which can be written down. We've all seen sticky notes on people's monitors where they have their password written down, or it can be freely given out. And that's exactly what social engineering attacks device for, to get that information from you, or it could be some kind of keylogger or other method that's doing that. Then the natural progression on this concept and the next step is to ensure strong authentication methods. Now, this can be passwordless authentication, which Chris Lee introduced us, just did a series on. Could be MFA in conjunction with a very strong password policy. Just ways to, again, authenticate, prove who you really are. Then the next step I want to take a look at is the sign-in attempts themselves. We're going to measure the signals that we've already been given, and we're going to look for sign-ins from unfamiliar or atypical locations, from IP addresses that may be associated with suspicious activities, kind of the dark web, if you will, or even from devices that we just consider at risk. So these are really just some of the signals that you can use to measure against and to help minimize that risk of breach and protecting your data. The fourth part is going to really look at implementing, monitoring, and reporting on these activities. We're going to alert on suspicious events and actions, and then finally remediate when those actions are taking place. So a lot of this is going to really be focused on letting the tools do the remediation. So it may not even require any manual intervention on your behalf. Let the system handle that for you. And then lastly, we'll be looking at granting or adjusting access as appropriate. So far, everything we've really discussed has focused on the sign-in itself. And in this step, we're going to take into account all of those signals that we've talked about so far, and then make a determination on whether access will be provided or if other actions or adjustments are needed when granting access. And next slide, please. We're going to take a look at the dark days before Zero Trust and really prior to cloud computing even being in existence. If you happen to notice on the previous slide, there was the castle surrounded by a moat. That was a good analogy for what your network probably looked like in this slide, where you have a centralized location, your LAN, which is going to contain your users, workstations, data, applications, directory services, and so on. Typically, you're going to have bidirectional traffic with access controlled through a firewall to restrict access into your internal network and to control the data going out as well. And the old Cisco firewall days just be deny, deny, just allow when you know it needs to be allowed. Now, perhaps you may have a small subset of, or had a small subset of users that required VPN or some kind of remote access through a virtualized gateway of some sort. But really, otherwise, the firewall was designed to keep other traffic out. Now, with cloud environments being utilized more and more heavily, especially in the past couple of years, and then since the pandemic started, everyone's running remote. Most companies really have a model that's going to look like this next slide. And as that loads, you can see here in this diagram that the on-premise or office network has really moved from being the entire infrastructure or kind of the center of your IT universe to just a segment of a much broader picture. You now have devices that in some cases won't even be corporately owned, accessing hosted applications, different as a service workloads, could be multiple cloud providers, and many other items that you won't necessarily be in your private cloud data center. Your control over many of these points is limited, so identity and identity protection becomes really absolutely crucial in safeguarding your data from these dispersed endpoint connections. This model, it does provide a lot of flexibility, not only in terms of access, but also at the speed of which these data endpoints may change or evolve, where you may add additional SaaS applications or increase your cloud footprint, maybe by acquiring another company or just adding another cloud provider. So the importance placed on these evolving data points require that you know really exactly who is accessing this data, how they're accessing the data, and then precisely what types of data endpoints they are accessing. Next slide, Rick. Okay, now is we'll look into some of the Zero Trust tools that are available from Microsoft. So there's a lot to digest on this slide as it builds out, which, by the way, this is from Microsoft. The link will be at the top right. If you do like the slide and want to see updated versions, they do update it from time to time. So it is, again, from the MCRA, I think it's Microsoft Cybersecurity Reference Architecture, if I have that right. So we can't take credit for the slide, but you know, it really does a great job of outlining the tools available and then how they work in concert to provide that zero trust model that we've been talking about so far and that we're going to discuss further. So I'm not going to read through each of these items to take up a whole session just on this slide alone. So please look through it as you can. But I do want to point out that we're really going to look at this starting from left to right, where you can see that the signals that we touched on earlier, they're on the left column. They're going to be taken into account and used to make an informed decision on not only the user ID itself, but also assess the risk associated with a sign-in, as well as the device from which the user is trying to authenticate with. And then those decisions are really in the center column. They're fed into the essentially a decision engine, which in the Microsoft world or vernacular is called conditional access. So these conditional access policies that you build will implement and determine if access is granted or if adjustments need to be made in order to ensure that you know exactly who is accessing that data and that they're accessing it from a healthy and a secure device. Now, this may or may not be a corporately owned device. So let's say the device is not corporately owned, but a personal device. You can still validate that the device is healthy, that's not compromised in any way, and then allow access in. You also have the option in those cases, this is where we kind of talked about making adjustments on access. So if the device is not corporately owned, but you still want to grant them access, you may restrict things like the ability to save the data locally on that device, print data. So generally just control how that data is consumed and whether what they can end up doing with that data. So now that we've covered the guidelines for Zero Trust and why there's a need for it, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Rick to get you started on the steps to implement Zero Trust.
Hey guys, I'm going to interrupt real quick with a question.
Sure.
And Rick, I'm not sure if you want to go back to that previous slide because it does show a lot of the products. Because the question is around licensing. What is needed to implement Zero Trust from a licensing perspective? And I know there's a lot of different products listed up there on that slide. So could you guys address what kind of licensing is required for Zero Trust in the Microsoft Cloud?
Yeah, that is actually a long and lengthy answer. So the short answer, it depends. So there are a lot of considerations to take into account when you talk licensing. And as a little self-promotion or plug into the next session, we're going to dive into licensing a little bit more. But the short answer, again, it does depend. So if you look at even the free tier, you can go ahead and implement the security defaults. So Microsoft does allow you to kind of use some of these features without having to buy the licenses for them. I will say that is very limited and it's an all or nothing. So if you do implement that, make sure you know exactly what's being implemented and the impact on the users. Otherwise, aside from that, you're really looking at an E3 license with probably the Intune add-on, at least Azure AD Premium 1. For some of the more advanced features, you'd need Azure AD Premium 2, and you could also just go with the M5 version, which is going to go ahead and incorporate all of those. So hopefully that gives enough information. It is just licensing is always a difficult concept, but again, we'll try and dive into that a little more with the next session in a couple weeks.
Okay, great, thanks. Sorry to cut you off there, Rick, on your introduction.
Oh, no problem, no problem. And actually, that's a good segue into if anyone has any questions, feel free to interrupt, or you can ping it in the message for any of these slides or areas. We'll gladly stop and answer your question. But thank you, Mike. Thank you for that introduction and step through. The next section, I'm going to cover the components of Zero Trust and how to move into that journey to Zero Trust. We're going to cover some of these areas such as identity, endpoints, data. We're going to touch on some apps, and we're going to kind of lump infrastructure and network together. Some of these areas are very in depth, so we may just go high level. Keep in mind that if you want any more information, we can provide that, and we can also do sessions specifically On identity alone could take a whole session. So just let us know if you need more information. So this is also to mention an iterative process. You won't be implementing all these controls at once. It's actually not even recommended to do so because who knows what could break or be restricted. It's again an iterative or layered process, it's always starting with identity, which we'll cover first. As I mentioned, everything starts with identity to authenticate to your resources, to gain access to resources. And this usually starts in the Microsoft world with Azure AD or AAD. This kind of supports everything else that has to do with identity. And the way to really enforce anything to do with Azure Active Directory access, as what Mike mentioned, is conditional access policies. Really, that is the enforcement arm of anything identity related. Think of conditional access as rules that basically dictate what actions can be implemented, what areas can be accessed. It's quite a powerful tool. I think many of us have used conditional access accidentally and locked people out, locked whole groups of people or everybody out. So it's very powerful, but it's really quite easy to implement as well. Lastly, I wanted to mention in the identity world is AAD password protection. This feature is native to all cloud accounts. You can sync it with on-prem as well. You can take advantage of the password protect feature of on-prem. We're kind of moving away from passwords, right? With a lot of the tools they're implementing nowadays. But having a strong password is still pretty valuable in today's world. It's just another layer of protection. Again, we're moving to passwordless environment, but still enforcing strong passwords is highly recommended. So the next area in the zero trust journey is device management. So we go from identity to the actual device management and protection. Now, a lot of enforcement is done through cloud services such as Intune, which is now called Microsoft Endpoint Manager or MEM. Through Intune, you can use things such as compliance policies. Compliance policies basically label a device. That's all it does. Compliance policy doesn't do any enforcement, but it labels a device where then a conditional access policy could enforce. For example, a compliance policy could be based off of your patch level on a device or whether or not the device is encrypted. And if it is not, and you have a rule saying it needs to be encrypted, well, then that device is labeled as non-compliant. And then you can build conditional access saying, if a device is non-compliant, meaning it's not encrypted, do this, whether it's locking out of cloud resources, whether it's sending an email to your service desk to have them reach out to the user. There's lots of options in that. Another feature, a lot of people aren't familiar that just because you're cloud-based, you still can access network resources through a hybrid join method. So there's two types of devices that can be cloud registered. You can do an Azure AD only registration for your endpoints, or you can do what is known as a hybrid join approach, which means you're still cloud or Azure joined, but you're also domain on-prem joined. And this scenario is most useful for organizations that have a pretty robust and archaic group policy configuration. There are tools, and Intune has a tool to migrate group policy into using cloud configuration profiles. But I'm not going to lie to you, it's a pretty in-depth process. There is a wizard that can migrate the group policy objects into Intune, but they really don't configure them. They just tell you, yeah, we have some settings that can apply, or no, we don't have settings that are direct application from that GPO into an Intune policy. So depending on the size of your group policy architecture, it could take a long time to migrate them. So that's why a lot of people choose to do just the hybrid join methodology for now, until they migrate all their group policies. Another endpoint management tool is the mobile management components of MEM or Intune. These you can use profiles again, because most mobile devices are BYOB. There are some corporate, but most still seem to be BYOB. And depending on your device, whether it's iOS or Android, you can compartmentalize or kind of segregate the workspace or the apps that can be controlled via your mobile device. Again, we can go into a whole day of mobile device management because there are a lot of options around that.
Hey, Rick. This might be a
Sure.
question for both you and Michael, but question is around the passwordless authentication and how does that exactly fit into Zero Trust, because it's not one of the little bubbles that's called out on the slide there for the identity.
Yeah, so great question. I kind of mentioned, or I think we both have mentioned passwordless a little bit, but we haven't really delved into it. So, Chris, I'll give you another plug, and perhaps you can put the link to it in the chat for the series that you did on password. But again, with the username password model being kind of antiquated, just risks associated with it, it's information that can be given. So passwordless is really about not what you know, but it's about who you are. So you're providing biometric data that only you possess. You can't give that out, and it's also what you have. So it could be FIDO2, some kind of multi-factor component to it. So it is inherently a lot more secure because you can't provide someone your thumbprint or facial recognition. So there are a lot of things with passwordless that just make it much more secure than the old username password method. So that's how it really fits into Zero Trust, just further identifying or validating who you are rather than just, here's my username and password.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So the next section on our journey, so we've covered identity, we've covered endpoint. Now we're going to talk about data security and management. There are a few tools in the Microsoft bag that cover this, and that's one is Azure Information Protection, or AIP. One is Data Loss Protection, or DLP. And lastly, Office Messaging Encryption. With Azure Information Protection, again, another big subject, pretty large scope, but I wanted to touch on it. This is the Microsoft Cloud product. It assists organizations with applying labels or labeling documents to categorize them and to protect electronic records. So it's basically a tool that labels documents or categorizes them to do action upon them. Kind of similar to data loss protection rules. These are rules that basically say what and what cannot be sent outside or inside an organization. For example, you put a data loss protection rule on email, and it says you can't send out an email that has a social security number or a credit card number. That DLP rule would stop it from a message being sent out. Again, that's another area that is pretty wide in breadth, but pretty powerful tool. And lastly, in data management, you have the O365 message encryption. This basically secures your content payload. A lot of people don't realize this, but email is not really a secure means of communication. Emails can be sent over clear text, unencrypted channels. So basically, O365 message encryption protects and encrypts the message before being sent out. Next section is application protection. Again, another deep dive area, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in this area, such as Azure Active Directory single sign-on, Azure Active Directory application proxy, single sign-on. It's important even for third-party SaaS apps. Users don't need to require authentication. You can use single sign-on to access resources such as Salesforce, Workday, O365. And what's nice about setting up single sign-on is if you do get prompted, that's when you know something is wrong. So if AAD single sign-on is set correctly and you're accessing, let's say, Salesforce or Workday, and you're logging in and all of a sudden you're getting prompted for credentials, that's probably an indicator that something is wrong. Another powerful tool, it used to be used a lot more, but it kind of doesn't get used as much as it should nowadays, is Azure AD proxy or Active Directory proxy. This basically is a tool that you can port on-prem applications and publish them in AAD. Basically, it wraps a cloud security feature around the application. There's multiple benefits to using AAD proxy. You can remove the requirement for VPN connection to access some resources. And you also, again, when you wrap it, have all the cloud security features that you can utilize. So AAD proxies is a really nice tool, especially if you have a lot of on-prem apps or legacy apps that you want to use some cloud security around. So the last components in the controls we're going to cover is network and infrastructure. I put these two together because they're kind of lumped in the same area. With Zero Trust, we're mostly focusing on M365 services, but there are pieces in network infrastructure that you can focus on. And really the main piece is a SIM, or Microsoft SIM is the Azure Sentinel product, which is SIM stands for Security Information and Event Management, SEIM. And again, this tool, it's basically a monitoring component that will allow you to see, it just gathers lots of data and uses algorithms to see and react to things that may be going on in your organization that aren't supposed to be going on. Again, it uses pretty powerful algorithms to sense something that shouldn't be going on and send you alerts about it. So we've talked a lot about the components. Now let's switch over to how you actually protect and use Zero Trust to protect these components. Just as we started the discussion with identity, in protection with cloud security, we start with identity. Identity compromises Identity compromise is still the #1 type of attack in cloud environments by far. Password-based attacks like brute force or password spray, they're becoming less frequent. Those aren't the attacks in vogue right now. It's other vectors that are taking focus. But still, even with password-based attacks, you still want strong authentication because they still happen. And the very low-hanging fruit to implement in any organization is MFA, or multi-factor authentication. It's the key to protecting, especially password-based attacks. It requires minimum effort to implement through cloud. Enabling your users, just implementing MFA per Microsoft prevents over 99% of password-based attacks. Again, password-based isn't the most popular exploit nowadays, but implementing MFA will pretty much resolve all password-based attacks. But there are other risk factors for password-based. There's legacy authentication. That's logging in using the old forms-based authentication. If you remember those back in the day, like SMTP, POP3, things like that. A more recent one is OAuth consent URLs. Basically, this is let's say you receive an invite to a document share, like a DocuSign type thing. With OAuth consent, you click on the link to provide your consent to a file or to fill something out, and it will ask for your permission to read information, to read your profile, username, things like that. What's so powerful about these OAuth breaches is that you're creating a connection using your credentials, and this information can be used even if you change your password, it can be used ongoing. So OAuth is a pretty popular one nowadays. So phishing. Phishing has become the #1 threat to identity compromise. If you see this chart here, this chart is Microsoft, and it's a basically what this chart shows is that as of the beginning of 2021, it was password-based attacks that were more popular. But as you see, as of the end of the year and still going into this year, it's phishing that has taken the lead by far and is exponentially expanding. This is an actual Microsoft Digital Defense report published. The reason phishing is so popular now is that it's it's become more sophisticated. You probably have heard pretty recently of a couple companies, pretty sensational reports of breaches. One was a gas company and one was a software company. Those were breaches done through phishing attacks. And I think the reason they're so successful nowadays is that they're not what they used to be. Phishing attacks, phishing emails were so easy to spot back in the day. They were poorly written. There was bad grammar. There was misspellings. They were so easy to identify, but now they've become much more sophisticated. You're not talking about script kiddies or individuals engineering phishing attacks. This is now an actual industry. There's entire tools, supply chains, and services that provide tools to build phishing attacks and phish kits. There's companies, there's services you can hire to use for targeted phishing campaigns. So it's becoming very complex, very sophisticated, and unfortunately very successful. Phishing is often used to steal credentials, but now there are also morphing into different tools for or ways to or methodologies for distributing things such as malware. You can use things like password protected zip files, URLs with the CAPTCHA sites. So there's lots of ways instead of just emails with links in them. Phishing now has expanded into other arenas. So this is why defense and breach or layered security approach is so important to stop phishing, which again is the most important or the most used vector now. There's no one solution, unfortunately, to protect against phishing. It's a layered approach using tools. For example, I'm going to say MFA again, and I'm going to probably say it on every slide. MFA is going to prevent many of the attacks right out of the box. You also need to implement controls such as conditional access, and you want to implement Azure AD capabilities to enforce least privilege. Again, least privilege hopefully will control the scope of a breach. So things like that. Again, there's no one out-of-the-box product that will protect all phishing attacks. It's a layered approach, starting with multi-factor authentication. A new kid on the block with phishing is SMS-based phishing attacks. or text messages. You get a text message. An example in this slide is, I'm sure we may all have seen this. Click on this link. Your account has been breached. Something is wrong. A very popular one is, we notice a transaction on your credit card or Amazon account that doesn't look right. Please click this link to verify. These are SMS-based phishing attacks. Most mobile devices are still BYO. And in this example, a message was received saying there was a unusual account change, and to click on the link. And of course, that link goes to a malicious URL. Strong, just like phishing at endpoint, strong practices around least privilege to limit the scope of a breach. Patching is important for not only endpoint, but mobile device management. And Defender for Endpoint is also a very powerful tool in preventing a lot of these attacks. I'm not going to go over the depth of Defender for Endpoint, but basically you can set up security baselines, and security baselines are through Defender, a Microsoft's certified settings for attack reduction. So you don't have to go into every component of encryption, a smart screen for edge, things like that. The baseline is Microsoft's way of saying these are all our recommended security settings for your environment. And that can be implemented through Intune for Defender for Endpoint. I will be, and to bring up a subject coming up after Mike's next session, I'm going to be doing a session on the Defender products and how they relate to Zero Trust. So that's coming in a few weeks. We'll delve into Defender for Endpoint and all the Defender products much deeper. So the last couple sections we're going to talk about are ransomware and malware. Good old ransomware. They're still being used. The newest approach actually to ransomware is a much more targeted approach. So ransomware in the past was just pushing out everywhere, hoping to strike home, but now ransomware is much more sophisticated, much more targeted. Attackers are doing research. They're doing reconnaissance on a specific company they target. They do this reconnaissance to find out, to look at your data, to look at your files, to maximize their return. So, for example, you uncover financial data for a company. Well, that information will be able to help you identify what you can actually pay in ransom, so they maximize their return. Most ransomware attacks, the breach goes undetected. I think the average is still over 300 days. So it's laying in wait while they gather and review your data. Another practice, a new practice, is to extract your data. So grab copies of your data before they encrypt your data. That way, even if you pay the ransom, they can extort you for years because they still have your data. And so how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect ourselves from ransomware and malware? Using device management such as Intune to ensure endpoints and applications are patched and at current levels. Intune, a couple of years ago, started implementing updates for business, which is a much more successful way to deploy patches in your environment through the cloud, through Microsoft, than through other traditional deployment methods such as System Center Configuration Manager. Another way to protect, again, is using least privilege to stop the spread of if an attack is successful, at least it prevents any lateral movement because of least privilege is put into place. Also using tools like OneDrive and SharePoint for your file storage. Because these support versioning, meaning let's say they take the current versions of your files, you still have older versions of the files. Now there's still a problem and you still need to resolve the issue with the ransomware or the malware, but at least you can keep up and running with older versions of your files. And again, I'll talk about strong authentication MFA. It's the quickest and easiest way to protect yourself. And lastly, we'll talk about malware. Malware, whether distributed through email or through links or other sources, is still pretty successful. And this is because of unpatched machines. Through quality updates and feature updates by Microsoft, which they started implementing with Windows 10, does help a lot. Before that, I don't know if you recall the days of pushing out individual patches, and so many endpoints in your environment were at different patch levels, and that was a bear to get your arms around. It's still a problem, and there's still endpoints that don't get the latest updates and whatnot, but at least it's a lot easier to focus on those endpoints with quality updates. But unpatched endpoints are still the biggest weakness for malware spread. And another a new technique for malware is they hijack file hosting sites, even reputable ones like Google Drive and OneDrive. And what's really tricky about that is they kind of provide a degree of evasion. These sites, they look trusted, they look good, so a lot of your protection detection tools don't see it coming. Okay, I think we'll stop there. Does anyone have any questions, or Chris, do you want to take it from here?
And no other questions came in. I know the one thing that we did leave out is the schedule for the upcoming sessions that fill out the rest of the mini series that you and Michael are working on. So I'll just kind of mention them here. Excuse me.
Sure.
So our next one is 2 weeks from today, June 15th at noon Eastern. And that will be Michael's presentation on enabling identity and device policies for Zero Trust. So Michael, keep me honest here, but I think you're going to be walking through some of the policy settings within some of the tools that we talked about, conditional access and things like that, to align with a recommended architecture from Microsoft for enabling Zero Trust in the enterprise. And then on June 29th, 2 weeks after that, same time, 12 p.m. Eastern, Rick, you will have your next session on aligning Defender solutions with Zero Trust. And Microsoft is always renaming everything, so they've kind of clumped a lot of their security-specific tools as Defender products. And it's not always clear what Defender you were talking about, whether it's Defender for Identity, Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Microsoft 365. So how do we align all those with Zero Trust? I think that's what you'll be talking about on June 29th. But those are the upcoming sessions to our webinar. As I said, there are no other questions that came in. So I guess with that, we will go ahead and wrap up. We appreciate everyone's time attending our webinar series, and we will hope to see you next time. Thank you. Very good job, Michael and Rick.
Thanks, guys.
Yep. Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for attending.